Hey everybody, in this unit we're going to talk about extinction. We're going to have a focus on Alabama, but we're also going to scale up to the level of global extinctions. Now, I like to start off with the picture of this bird. This is the yellow-shafted flicker. It's the Alabama state bird. And this is a bird that in parts of the U.S. has been declining at a rate of about 10% per year. And you don't have to do much math to figure out that a species population is not going to stick around very long if it's declining that rapidly. This is a pretty widespread bird that we see today, but it's very likely that at the rate of the loss of the species over the next couple decades, we could see this species go extinct. And I just bring this up to illustrate that this is how extinction begins, with populations that are doing fine, gradually start losing ground, and numbers go down and down and down until something finally knocks them out completely. We're going to explore some other scenarios and other examples of this as we go along, but first we need to cover some terms. Extirpation is the term for localized extinction. So if the yellow-shafted flicker, the bird in the previous slide, were to disappear from Alabama but still being found in Mississippi, we would say that the bird is extirpated from Alabama. Whereas on the other end of the continuum, you have biological extinction down here at the very bottom. That would be what we call complete extinction. It's not found anywhere else alive on the planet, not even in zoos. In between is what we call ecological extinction. This is when a population has becomes so small that even though the species is in the environment, it's just not having the role that it used to back when it was more abundant. That would be, for example, if in all of the southeast we only had just a handful of beavers left. So we had very few beaver ponds, and all the ecosystems that the beavers created and the species that they sustained were only found in a very few places. That would be an example of ecological extinction. Okay, so I want to go over a couple of stats with you about Alabama. These are not bragging stats. This is bad news for Alabama. It turns out that we have more extinct species than pretty much any other state except Hawaii. We'll talk about Hawaii in just a minute. So we rank number 2 for total extinctions. And if you look at current species that still live in Alabama, at least about 15% of them have characteristics that make them vulnerable to extinction. We're going to talk about what those extinctions are what those characteristics are in just a few minutes. If you look at species that are currently at risk of extinction because they have had populations declining, we rank number 4 in the U.S. for total species at risk. So let's do a quick review of some examples of the species we've lost from Alabama, paying particular attention to the lessons to be learned from that. I want to start off with this bird. This is the passenger pigeon. It was a bird about the size of the doves that you see in Alabama today, just a little bit larger and a little bit more colorful. And at the time that the Euro-Americans colonized North America, these were the most abundant birds on the continent. In fact, it's estimated that that there were more passenger pigeons than all other birds combined at the time, which is just mind-blowing to think about because the species is now extinct. And there's a couple reasons why it went extinct. It lost a lot of habitat as we cleared land for agriculture, of course. But there was also something happened after the Civil War, which I'm highlighting here with my laser pointer. Hopefully you can see that. That with the invention of the refrigerated railroad car, it allowed hunters to go into the colonies where these pigeons were nesting and harvest the entire colony and ship them to the East Coast cities like Baltimore, New York, for consumption. And it was these pigeons, they nested in trees, like dozens and dozens and dozens of them, just on one branch. And one tree could have hundreds to maybe thousands of passenger pigeon nests in the tree. So what they would do is they'd wait till the birds were just about to hatch, till the birds were just about to fledge, when the young birds were about to fly. So they were big and plump, but they hadn't started flying. Then they'd cut down the tree and gather up all the helpless birds and then kill them and then ship them to the East Coast. And they were so efficient in doing this with the hunting that they basically killed out nearly every one of them, although there was one that was kept in captivity and it died in 1914. So the lesson here is that that even the most common species can be driven to extinction. In this case, this bird was prized because of its meat and the fact that it was very gregarious. It liked to hang out in large groups. Those made it very vulnerable. Something that put it basically because it was very tasty, it put a target on its back, and because it was gregarious, it made it easy for us to wipe out a lot of them all at once. Another example of a bird that we lost in Alabama and other parts of the Southeast is this bird. This is the Carolina parakeet. They used to thrive throughout the Southeast. They travel in these noisy flocks, much like you'd see in parts of the tropical world today. They were hunted at first because they were basically, they would go into fruit orchards and they'd eat the fruit or damage the fruit, and because that would ruin the crop, the orchard owners would shoot these birds. And unfortunately, these birds are very, very intelligent. Parrots are some of the most intelligent animals on the planet. And when one individual would get shot and fall to the ground, all the other parrots would fly down and gather around it as if they were worrying, like, well, what happened to you? Are you okay? Get back up again. And so it was usually then with the second shotgun blast that would take out the rest of the flock. So it was pretty easy to decimate these birds for some reasons that are kind of similar to what we saw with the pigeons. There was also this strange, well, in retrospect, this strange fad for many years that you see at the bottom picture down here of putting brightly colored feathers and even entire birds on women's hats. So this woman has 2 birds on her hat. I can't quite tell what the bottom one is, but the top one is definitely looks like a parrot based on that bill. And of course, there is no muscle and guts or anything like that. It's just the feathers and the skin, the beak, and the legs of the bird. But this was like a raging fashion at the time. So there was lots of hunting of many bird species, including these parakeets. And the lesson here is that sometimes it's human fads that lead to species going extinct. Today we see that with many species, like rhinoceroses are being killed off for their horn, elephants are being killed off for their tusks, and many other species are being killed off for various body parts that are sometimes thought to have medicinal uses or magical uses, these sorts of things in different cultures. So it's unfortunate and it's unnecessary that species are going extinct for these reasons. Okay, the last example I'll use in terms of Alabama extinctions and the lessons to be learned is of a fish, since one of our themes here has been a focus on our aquatic species. This is a little fish called the white-lined top minnow. It was known only from one spring in Huntsville, Alabama, a little spring called that fed water into a creek called Spring Creek. And this little minnow had the unfortunate luck to be in right where a city started to grow up, and people would take water from the spring, and especially during droughts, they would take lots of water, and basically there was no stream left anymore during those times, and the fish died out. So this was an example of where you had habitat loss and degradation leading to the extinction of a species. So the lesson to be learned here is that species with limited distributions, in this case a fish that only lived in one little creek, those species are particularly vulnerable to extinction because they don't have any backup populations anywhere. They're just confined in a small area. Okay, another term that I want you to learn is that of secondary extinction. That's when one species goes extinct and other species that are dependent on it also go extinct. So check out these birds to the right. This is the Hawaiian honeycreeper, and you'll notice immediately that it's got a very pronounced long decurved bill, very strange looking bill. Well, this bill had evolved for the bird to get nectar out of flowers of these flowering shrubs that were found only in Hawaii. And the bird was only found only in Hawaii. Well, when Europeans visited the islands and introduced avian malaria, basically a form of malaria that only birds carry, and it was thought that the chickens that they had on the ship were carrying the malaria, and that's how it got to the islands. And when avian malaria hit bird populations of all different species in Hawaii, this is thought to have caused the extinction or near extinction of many different species. Well, in this case, the Hawaiian honeycreeper was the only species that pollinated a couple of plants. And by being the only pollinator, when the Hawaiian honeycreeper went extinct, those plants lost their ability to reproduce. And as those plants eventually aged and died out, they were not being replaced by any younger plants. And so you had essentially an extinction cascade where you lost a bird species and then a series of plant species. So this is what we call a secondary extinction. The primary target of the impact of the humans was the birds, and then the secondary impact, the secondary extinction, was the plants. And this also illustrates that something that might seem unimportant to some people, such as a bird species like this, can actually be quite important. And it's really hard to tell sometimes how important a plant or animal is until it's gone, unfortunately. Okay, back to some Alabama stats. I've now got a table up here on the right that shows you the top 10 states in terms of extinctions. And I want to point out Hawaii is at the very top, 217 extinctions. Islands are a special case. We already have talked about how islands are a type of environment where it's really easy for new species to evolve because allopatric speciation is so easy to happen on islands. But island populations tend to be very small. Islands tend to be very small. And there tend to be fewer resources, less habitat, and no or very few backup populations. Only backup populations if there's nearby islands that the species has colonized. And so islands around the world have seen a lot of extinctions, and Hawaii, unfortunately, is one of them. But if you set Hawaii aside, because it's a special case by being an island, Alabama is at the very top of U.S. states for extinctions. And it's at the top by a wide margin. The nearest state is California with 53 extinctions. These data are about 20 years old, so these numbers might have shifted just a little bit. But overall, Alabama is going to be holding on to that position for a long time. These are just some stats that kind of illustrate where we've lost the species in the state. We've lost 2 species of fish, maybe a third. We're not sure about the Alabama sturgeon. We've got some limited evidence to suggest it's still around, but it hasn't been seen in a long time. We've lost 31 species of snails. 2 additional species have been extirpated, and we've lost to extinction 11 species of mussels. 2 additional mussels have been extirpated. Remember, mussels are dependent on fishes. Remember that mussels are parasites, and their larvae hitch a ride on fishes. Some of these mussels have lost populations in part because fish populations have declined as well. Okay, I'm going to end this segment of this unit right now, and our next topic will be, so what? What does it matter that these species are going extinct?